Hello, everybody. Welcome to yet another week of our wonderful class pitch world. First and foremost, I want to give a shout out to my wife who has, wrong way, gussied up my background here with a beautiful plant. Thanks so much to all of you who are joining either live or or on delay. I'm checking our connection right now because I noticed the last few weeks that I've been on. The first week we were looking great, and then for some reason the last 2 weeks we've been all pixely and everything. So let me know how I'm coming through on your end. I want to make sure. I know there's a few of you already in here, so if you're in the comments, let me know if you can hear me, if you can see me all right. And if not, I'll go move to another room. We'll make this a traveling show, whatever we have to do. I'm super excited to jump into this week's class. I feel like I was just talking to my wife earlier today. Like, I can't believe that the festival is so soon. I was finalizing my travel plans this week and everything, and we're actually going to do this live. So I'm super stoked. And yeah, it's like get the last few weeks, the feedback that I've gotten from all of you has just been freaking amazing. So this is something that I think we're going to do either on an ongoing basis after the festival, or do kind of like chunks where we're going to do like 7 week classes at a time. Um, I want to keep doing this. I love working with you all on this. Obviously, I love like the world of pitching, the art of it. It's this like really specialized form, as I'm sure some of you are starting to realize. And it's like, it's its own little art form. So I'm waiting for everybody to, I'm going to give it a couple more minutes, make sure whoever's coming in can hop in the room. Awesome. Looks good. Sounds good. This is just a reminder to, if you are either on Facebook or YouTube, if you're listening to this live and you have a question, I'm listening. So go ahead and drop a comment in the chat there. And, if something doesn't make sense, or if you want a little more clarification on something, I'm here to help. I'm here to teach. So even if you have a particularly specific question, throw it in there. And if I can answer it, I'll answer it. I also, if you've been watching these, I would also love to know any like overall questions that you have that we can discuss really in depth at the festival. Because that one, because of the nature of it, we're going to be able to have a lot more back and forth. I'm going to allow a lot more time for Q&A. So I want to make sure that everyone's questions and concerns can get answered, and that I'll also be able to teach you the things that you don't know that you don't know, because that's one of the big things is that when you don't know what you don't know, that can often be the biggest Achilles heel that you have. So with that in mind, let's jump into the class. Like I do every week, I will introduce myself, tell you a little bit about my background. My name is Carlo Gonzales-Moss. I'm a writer, I'm a producer, and an executive. And I founded a company called MARANTY Media that specifically focuses on pitching. This is a class that we're doing in conjunction with Catalyst, but I also run my own company and do coaching on the side privately. If you are prepping a pitch or you just want to get really good at pitching really fast, we can do that. So go to maranty.com, promo code Catalyst. You get your first class absolutely free. That's a deal that I've made with Catalyst to make sure that we can get as many of you in the door as possible. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing I want to talk about, I want to address a couple of things from our last class, which if you remember was all about characters and your series overview. One thing that, as I was reviewing my notes, that I wanted to make sure was really clear. If you have multiple characters that you want to showcase, like let's say, for example, that you have just a really big ensemble and you got through your main characters, but you don't want to spend a bunch of time like saying like, and there's all these cool supporting characters. I see this happen a lot in animation, right? Think about The Simpsons. They have so many amazing characters. If they were pitching that show, they can't possibly go into all of them. But there's a really cool thing that you can do if you want to address your first, like, let's say 3 or 4 main characters, give them their own section like we were talking about last week. A great thing that I like to do, if you have a bunch of characters you want to showcase, give a nod to the rest of the world with one big page showing all of your supporting characters, and then you can bring up a select 1 or 2. So what I'm going to do is show you in one of my projects. I think last time I talked to you about the last few weeks, I've talked about one of my projects, Shark Tour, right? And showing you examples from that because I thought the team that worked on that did a really great job. So when it came to Shark Tour, I'll show you what we did. So we went through all of our main characters, talked about them in depth. Um, but then when it came to our supporting characters, we did this. All right, so so we finished up our supporting characters. Let's go ahead and go into some presentation mode here so you can see. So we had these supporting characters. There's beautiful Mark. He's great. These were the bad guys. They were not so great. And then we said, and we've got a ton more main characters that we want to talk, that we would love to share with you, but we don't want to take up all of your time. So we'll just, go through a couple of them here. And so we had this big, beautiful page that showed the great art that had been created and showed off all these cool characters. And it just gives you a taste, just enough to whet your palate of like, oh my God, this is a huge, expansive world without overwhelming the executive. And so what we did here, the line that we created for one of the writers was, and I know you're looking at this and the first person you're thinking of is Monty. And then we went into Monty and we talked about her up there in the corner. She's a half hawk, half manatee. And we kind of explained her whole deal, gave her like a little mini description, did the same thing for Captain Frank. And then we talked about the fact that like all of these characters are going to be involved. It's going to be a huge, expansive world. But we didn't want to take up all of your guys' time, so we'll leave that to the different stories. But that gives them a taste of like, oh my gosh, this is a really big thing that's existing. This was a question that came up last week that I wanted to get back to as well. Are weird character names an issue? No, not at all. I would say if you have like a particularly unusual character name, what's going to help it is making sure that it's presented on screen, right? So the way that you're saying, it's not being confused if you're saying something that doesn't sound exactly clear. If it's on screen, then we go, okay, great. I would so much rather have a really unique name that's a little bit off kilter than a character named Mark Smith, right? Like one of my passions, and I could do a whole class on names of characters. I literally, when I was doing Most Popular Girls, I literally had a system to try to figure out names. The whole show was set in high school. I'll give my secret away right now. The show was set in high school. And so I looked up what were the most popular baby names in, say, 2010, because we wanted to get those really like stereotypical, like millennial, like cutesy names for all these characters because they were popular high school girls. So I'd go through there and be like, okay, 2010 most popular baby names. And then I would go through because I wanted to make sure that I had really unique but real sounding last names. And so I would go through, say, the 1992 Oakland A's roster and just pull out interesting last names that sounded like real things. That's how I landed on characters that were named very specifically: Mackenzie Zales, Shay Van Buren, Trisha Capoletti, Brittany Matthews. All of these characters, like the more unique you can make those characters, the better. So not only are weird character names not an issue, bring them on. Like use your uniqueness. It goes back to that point that I made last week where like a lot of times we catch ourselves and we think that we have to be more boring than we want to be, right? Remember I told that story about my friends who like were these really interesting people and their main character was like the most mediocre white guy because they felt like that's what a main character had to be. Same thing goes for names. Like have fun with it. Like, and like let them, we want them to be realistic. We want them to sound like people, but like, please let them be unique. Let them be weird. All the more power to you on that front. Also, a quick technical note that I've noticed sometimes happens. I talk a lot about your visual aids, right? Your Keynote or your PowerPoint. One thing I want to make sure that you never do, and it would be completely understandable to do this, but never ever use a presentation that's a PDF. Okay? I know it's like, it sounds like a little minor thing, but I've seen this happen. You want to use an actual presentation program. So we're talking about either Keynote, Google Slides, or PowerPoint, or something similar. But don't open up a PDF, because a PDF, not only will it not render the same, you don't have like the animation abilities that you do in Keynote. Like whenever I create a Keynote, I always like to put in, a character dropping in, little things appearing. It's simple stuff that just keeps the viewer's attention a little tiny bit more. Remember, we always talked about those shorthand things. So, putting on a little bit of a show, letting them know that you're a pro and you know how to do this. And PDFs don't allow you to do that. And then they also have this little problem where every time you switch a page, it'll put up a little note like page 10 of 45. And it might not be 45 pages, but each slide is technically a page, each little element that you want to put in there. I've seen that on presentations. I'm looking at it going like, oh my God, there are 45 slides in this presentation. So do not open up PDFs to be shared. Definitely, when you send your pitch decks afterwards, send them as a PDF. 100% do that. But your PDF is not your presentation. That should be in Keynote, PowerPoint, Google Slides, or something similar, okay? So with all of that being said, if you have any character questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. We'll circle back around at the end of our class today. But for right now, we are going to jump into pilot, sample episodes, and your season arc. So today we're really talking about story. That's what's at the heart of all of this. These are all different variations on the stories that you're telling. Last week was all about characters. This week is all about story. And those are the two main components of your pitch and your series. So the place where we start, okay, hold on. Let me get my little banners ready and everything, is the pilot. So when we talk about the pilot, this is going to be obviously the first and most in-depth of your sample episodes. Oh, by the way, before I start, I wanted to show off my mug for today. So this is from a show that I produced, I think a year and a half ago, called The Stockholms. It was a YouTube show that ended up doing way better than any of us expected. Animated show. So that's the mug for today. Now, when I was genuinely thirsty and dry in the throat, I wasn't trying to stall for time. But we're talking about the pilot, the first and most in-depth of your sample episodes. So the pilot is an absolute essential in your pitch, especially if you're pitching a serialized show. But even if you're not, even if your show's completely episodic, you still probably want to have a pilot in your in your pitch. The other thing is, if your show is episodic but has a very specific premise pilot, you're also going to want to make sure that pilot is in there in depth. A good example of this type of situation is Cheers. The action that happens in the pilot sets up the rest of the show, even though the show itself is completely episodic, right? You can drop in at any moment with Cheers, but that pilot is what's called a premise pilot, where a specific thing happens in the pilot that sets off the events for the rest of the show. So in Cheers, it's Diane coming in with her fiance or husband, I forget, if they're married or not. She comes in and she gets left and she ends up taking a job at Cheers. And that's how the show starts. So that's what a premise pilot. The other type of pilot you might have is a slice of life pilot. For example, Seinfeld, which is also a completely episodic show, right? You can drop in at any point, but theirs is a slice of life pilot. There's no difference between the pilot and the other episodes from a storytelling perspective. Obviously, first season of Seinfeld is just okay. They didn't find their groove completely. So there's a big difference there, but it's a complete slice of life pilot. That being said, you also have, something that might be completely serialized that also has a premise pilot. So of course you're going to want to make sure to include that. A great example of that from a comedy perspective is The Good Place, right? That's a total premise pilot. Eleanor lands in what she thinks is heaven. Spoiler alert. And the show is going to be serialized every episode. So we definitely want the pilot in there. Now, if you're pitching an episodic show with a slice of life pilot, the Seinfeld example that we talked about, you still need to lay out the pilot in the pitch, specifically because the executive wants to be able to envision how the show starts and how we get introduced to all the characters and the world. I don't know why today, but I got something stuck in my throat. The other thing right now is, and this has shifted probably in like the last year or two, The industry best practice today, regardless of serialization, is to discuss your pilot in your pitch. It hasn't always been the case, but it's going to come up if you don't mention it. If you just roll straight into like, here's some sample episodes, in that Q&A, I can guarantee the executive is either going to ask you what happens in the pilot, or is one of the episodes that we discuss the pilot, because they're going to expect some level of exposition. They want to know, how do we actually get into this world, So we've established that we need to talk about the pilot in our pitch. Now let's talk about the goals of the pilot section of your pitch. So there's a few goals here. Number one, you want to expand the buyer's understanding of how the show works. So at this point, you've probably explained your show enough to the buyer that they understand the characters. We're assuming that you did a great job here. They kind of understand what's going to happen from your series overview. But now we're going to really get them to a point where they know your show, where they really have a handle on it. Another goal that we want to really hit is we want to bring the theoretical elements that we've been discussing into tangible reality, right? We've been talking about the characters. Oh, they have this type of personality. They'll do this, this, and this. Well, now we want to see them do that, that, and that. In the series overview, we might have talked about the types of adventures. We might have touched on some of these ideas on a very, very top level, really just kind of skim the surface. Now we can go a little bit more deep into it and talk about this world. We can really get into it. It's another reason why we want to make sure that we talk about the pilot, because that's the easiest way into the world, right? It has to have essential elements that bring us into the world. Another thing that we want to do with this section is we want to prove that we know how to tell a story and how to structure an episode of television, right? This is a little bit of proving your bona fides. This is proving that you know how to write, where you're going to lay out for this buyer, hey, I know how 3-act structure works. I know how to tell a really compelling story. The last thing that we want to do with this section is we want to leave it on a high note that leaves the buyer excited for the possibilities of where this show is going to go. And because then we're going to follow up with sample episodes that'll bring those possibilities into further focus. I'm just going to move my camera a little bit because I'm not lined up with my script here that's directly behind me. I've got my outline in front of me, and I notice I'm catching my eye line going diagonally because I didn't properly set up the computer the way that we all should when we're going into a pitch. Now I have my computer I've got my second screen directly behind me. So here we go. So we talked about leave on a high note that leaves the buyer excited, because our next section is the sample episodes. So we want to have momentum going from the pilot, going like, oh my God, this is going to be an amazing show. Boom, then right into the sample episodes. And when we talk about the pilot, this is essentially the moment where we prove the hypothesis of the previous sections. So we've been talking about all these things a little bit theoretically. We've been talking about how awesome it's going to be. We really feel like these characters are going to be fun on a TV show. We know all about them now, but now we actually get to see it. Now we get to feel how awesome these episodes are going to be and how great this storytelling is going to be. So when we get into the pilot section, we want to focus on the essentials that the executive needs to know to buy the pitch, to buy our show. We don't need them to understand every in and out, every intricacy of the storytelling. All we want to focus on is the bare essentials that you need to know to get this story, to get excited, and to say, yes, I need this on my network. It is so freaking easy when you're describing this pilot that you've spent so much time describing, that you've spent so much time digging into, figuring out the nuts and bolts and how it works. This is your baby. It's really easy to get lost in the details and to get really granular with it. Be careful of that. Focus on the essentials. Stay away from beat by beat explanation and err on the side of brevity, right? Because you probably have a pilot outline that you put together before you wrote your pilot. And at this point, I'm 50-50 on if you want to write a full pilot ahead of time, or if you just know your pilot story, know the outline of it. You can go either way with that, okay? But really clear, stay brief. I would say 3 to 5 minutes on this section. You don't want to sit in it too long. You just want to get out what's exciting about the show. Anything that will get a buyer to a point where they're going oh my God, I see this show. I can envision it. I know how the characters work. Get them excited and leave it at that. When we're thinking about it, you want to focus on the important elements of each act. So ask questions like these. What do we need to do to move the story along, right? Don't get bogged down into individual pieces of dialogue. I would say the only time when you want to do that is if you have a great like two-beat joke that you want to hit verbatim. You might want to drop in one or two of those, but do not get, like he said this and then she said this, which then means that this guy said this and then this guy said this and then this guy said this. I, as an executive, have lost track at that point. Keep the action propulsive and moving forward. Another question that you might want to ask, we're focusing on the important elements of each act. Is there a big set piece? Is there a moment in this particular act that everything is building toward or building around? That's where we want to focus our energy. Is something interesting being revealed, right? Is there some kind of a twist in the second act of the pilot? Well, we definitely want to hit that. Or maybe a character makes a big decision. These are all the little touchstones of each of your three acts that might be worth digging into a little bit. And that can be a really nice roadmap for you as you're building out that pilot section so that you don't get too bogged down. Because I will say it is way more common for me to hear somebody in a pitch talking about their pilot way too intricately than it is for someone to like barely touch on the pilot and for me to be like, oh, I wanted to know more. They always go way too deep as opposed to going way too shallow. Another big important thing about the pilot is you need to deliver on the promise of your premise. Remember what we said about backstory in the characters section? Like if your pilot is all about, oh, well, this person came from here and this person came from here, and that's the stuff we're focusing on, like that's not your show. When we were talking about backstory with the characters, we made the point of talk about the show that you're making. Same thing with the pilot and the pilot explanation. Focus on your premise. Your premise is, oh, it's these two people who find themselves in a cave and now they have to live in a cave. Well, the majority of the talk about that pilot should be the stuff that they're doing that got them into the cave, the stuff that they're doing once they're in the cave, not anything else. If it doesn't feel like the rest of the show, something is wrong. Another huge thing, use visual aids. I know I hit this over and over and over again, but use visual aids to keep the executives engaged in the story and to track the beats of your story. Okay. So when there was this really interesting thing that a fellow executive did for one of the projects that I was working on, I think last year, that I love and that I've stolen multiple times. And I've freely told her that I stole it multiple times. I have her permission to steal it. But in the pilot explanation, she went through and found icons for each individual beat of the pilot. So I think there's probably like 6 or 7 icons. And in the PowerPoint presentation, as the writers were explaining the pilot, one of those icons would pop up. I made a very rudimentary version of it that I'll bring up here just so that you can see. Let's get a screen share going. But this is a really great trick to help keep your audience's attention. So we've got this on here. Let's say that we're talking about this story, and it's about this woman, and she got an idea. And we're in Keynote or PowerPoint, so each of these different icons is going to pop up as we talk about them. They're not all going to be on the screen at the same time. But we're talking through our pilot, and our main character here, we'll call her Colleen. She has this great idea and this question that she's always wondered if she could ever climb a mountain. Okay, so she goes ahead and she starts putting together a strategy for how am I going to climb that mountain. Well, she decides I'm going to take steroids. So she takes a bunch of steroids and gets super swole. However, she also runs into the problem that the steroids make her very angry, and she doesn't like that. So she has to come up with a new plan. Something strikes her and she goes, oh, I can just hire somebody to climb the mountain for me as long as they look like me. So she hires someone that looks exactly like her to go ahead and climb a mountain. And that person climbs up this mountain, does all that work, takes a picture at the top of that mountain. And that's the story of how Colleen got a picture of her on the top of Mount Everest and accomplished her dream. So beat by beat, we bring up these little icons, and every time they pop up, they refocus the attention on the story and give a little bit of reminder of, oh, this is what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about. It's a fairly low lift with a big reward. So that's a little technique that I like to use, but ultimately use visual aids. The other thing that you can do if you're not going beat by beat visually like that is you can also just have a slide the same kind of way that we did with characters, and we'll dig into this more in our sample episodes. Um, but just a full-on sample slide that says pilot episode has a cool, compelling image that if it's animation, you might have made it originally, or if you're doing live action, I love pulling, stuff from shows or movies that live in a similar world, right? Because you're just trying to convey tone. So use visual aids as much as possible, because those visual aids are the things that those executives remember, because they're not only hearing it audibly, they're also seeing it visually. Those are the sticky things that remain in your brain. Another really important thing that I want to focus on when we're talking about the pilot is to avoid and then storytelling in your pilot. All right. So what does and then storytelling look like? What does it feel like? It's a story where every different plot point is connected by the words and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and also this happens. They don't build on each other. It's just successive storytelling, right? The words that we want to use instead of and then is, let's see, however, therefore, because of, since, yet. Those beautiful transition words. I mean, we're getting into like the nitty gritty of storytelling, right? You should have all of those therefores and howevers and because of because those create propulsive storytelling that gets you excited and that all links together. Don't get bogged down in the plot of, and this happens, and also this mountain gets climbed, and this, and this, and this. Because what we really want to focus on is story. And what is story? It's the characters and their relationships to each other. Plot is just a mechanism to really highlight that, So remember, the episode you are pitching now does not need to be word for word the episode that is going to be put up on screen one day if they buy it. You can consolidate characters and storylines if you need to. Like, let's say in your actual pilot that you've written, you've got, one kind of wild card character who does three things but never shows up again. You can either leave that out or consolidate it into one of the characters that you've talked about already, right? You move that action over. When you already have $1 million and you're making your show, nobody's gonna be like, actually, when you pitched it, you said that this happens. Like, storytelling and making TV is a dynamic thing. So you are not going to be married to the pilot that you pitch in the room. We expect it to change. We expect it to get better. And we also expect that you're not pitching the final version of it. Like, we're going to develop it with you as the executives. So go ahead and put it into a package that's easy to understand and that everybody can follow. So, you don't have to sit there in the and then and be like, I got to make sure that you get this. And I got to make sure that you get this. I got to make sure that you remember this, that actually doesn't really like have an effect on the show, but it's a part of the pilot. So I need to make sure that you understand it, right? Get rid of all of that. Just focus on the important essentials that you need to know to understand the show. And then probably take out a little bit more, because we as creators assume that you need to know more about the show than like the executives actually do. Give them a little bit less. Go ahead and trust that the storytelling is there and that they will understand it. Because oftentimes we think that you need a lot more to get it than you actually do. Another thing that I like to do is, your pilot will probably echo previous sections of the pitch, and I encourage that. Feel free to acknowledge it and remind the executives with phrases like, as we discussed, the story kicks off when. The stupid example I wrote on here was, as we discussed before, we talked about how the story really kicks off when Sheila finds this golden amulet in a diner that gives her eternal life. And then you can, maybe you've talked about that in your series overview. Now you can dig into the pieces of that in the pilot and what's going to happen after she finds a golden amulet in the diner that gives her eternal life, right? Well, then all of a sudden her ex-husband shows up and and we're off to the races, right? Make it exciting as you reveal where that moment that we already knew leads to, right? Because then you're also tying those executives into the story, right? Like, you guys already know this. You guys are already on board with this. Let's keep going. Let's go further into the story to figure out how we get all of this out. The other thing that might feel a little bit counterintuitive is that you do not necessarily need to walk us all the way through to the end of the story. Okay, so let me go ahead and make sure that I'm over here talking about the Bible. You don't need to necessarily need to walk us all the way through to the end of the story. You can actually leave us at a bit of a cliffhanger in the third act. You don't have to, but I want you to understand that where like if you're laying out the pilot and you just like you've cut everything that you can and it's still at 5 minutes, go ahead and cut the end and find a really exciting point that you can leave it at where a specific character like has a crazy decision to make, or that climactic third act moment where we think that all is lost, but we're going to see how our main character saves the day in the end. We're going to see if he's actually up to all the things that we said he was up to. Figure out a way to get out of there where you still leave your audience excited, but you don't have to dig into like how everything gets wrapped up neatly. If you're able to wrap it all up neatly, great, but don't worry yourself over trying to figure out how do I jam all of this stuff in here. Go ahead and leave it at a cliffhanger, and you'll be pretty successful. I have a constant reminder also. If it's a comedy, we need to be laughing throughout. I know I hit that in every section, but it's the most important, most overlooked thing. There'd better be at least one laugh coming from the story in at least each act. And when I say coming from the story, I mean organically from the story, something funny happens, not, oh, well, I need to put a joke in here, so I'm just going to say something silly and make fun of myself as I'm telling this or something, right? Like it needs to come from the story. We need to be well aware, like, oh, this show itself is funny, not just the guy pitching it. Also, bonus points if you can use this section to highlight clever ways that you get your exposition out in the pilot, right? Because we all know when you get into a pilot, it can be really difficult to do the work of getting exposition out, right? You have to introduce so many different characters. You got to introduce their relationships. You got to introduce the world. If you can find clever ways in the storytelling where that comes about, make sure to mention that in the pilot. I don't have a concrete example off the top of my head, but that's something that I'm always on the lookout for because it conveys a shorthand to the executive. Like, not only do you know how to tell a good story, you know expertly how to tell a story, and you know expertly how to create an episode of television, right? When you can slide exposition in elegantly, oh, that is everything to an executive, because I look at that and I go, oh my gosh, I'm dealing with a pro here who doesn't need to have a character walk up and say, oh, hello, my brother or sister. It is good to see you after all of these long lost years now that we are here at mom and dad's funeral. Like if you can find elegant ways to get your exposition out and you can find a way to highlight that as you're pitching your pilot, great, bonus points. Ideally, you also want to have a nice big opening set piece that's going to capture everyone's attention in your pilot. And this is like walking the line between like pitch coaching and script coaching and screenwriting. But that's a big piece of advice that I always give my creators is try to find that big set piece in your pilot that's going to capture everyone's attention and serve as a really clever way into your story. Think about your favorite shows. What's the opening image you're seeing? Because we really want to paint a picture as best as we can. If you're thinking about your favorite shows, the ones that came to mind for me as I was preparing for class today, Breaking Bad, you've got the underwear up in the sky, and then you've got, Walter, running around the desert in his underwear. That's going to be extreme, like that. Like you can paint that picture in the room and then start telling the story of your pilot from there, right? You're revealing that little mystery. Same thing with Lost, right? It's the eye opening. Even something like Big Mouth came to mind where you've got Andrew in his class, trying desperately to avoid his hormone monster, and he has to run out of class. It's sex ed class, and he's totally embarrassed. Like all of those are big set piece moments that open the show and that you can talk about in your pilot, because that's going to get an executive a really good idea of what your show is going to look like, and it's going to get them excited about the possibilities of your show. So that is the extent of the pilot part of your pitch. As always, that was a ton of information. So if you're watching this and you have a question or you have a comment, go ahead and leave it in the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on those. But if there aren't any comments or questions on that, we're going to dig into the next section, which is sample episodes. So I'm going to wait on comments while I take a big old sip of water. And when we're talking about sample episodes, let me define it first. So your pilot is obviously the first episode of your show. Sample episodes are designed to give your buyer a taste of the show. So you roll from pilot directly into like, hey, here are some episodes that we see happening in the first season. You want to dig in, stay specifically on first season episodes, doing yourself no favors if you're pitching an idea for an episode 4 seasons down the line. But the good news is it doesn't have to be episodes 2, 3, and 4, right? It can be kind of like picking and choosing. Oh, okay, we want to do an episode like this, or we want to do an episode like this. If your show is highly serialized, you might want to give us an idea of like, what does a mid-season episode look like? What does the finale look like? You want to make sure that you're linking together the story that you're telling. But really, you're giving kind of a sampler platter of your show. Like, hey, okay, so you got the opener. You understand how we get into the world. Now that we're in the world, we're going to explore the world, right? We're going to go a little bit wider. We're going to, touch on all of those characters that we discussed in the pilot. We're going to see them in their element, So when you go from pilot to sample episode, as I talk about in every section when we're transitioning, use your connective tissue. Transition elegantly into this section. Leave us on a high note in your pilot that will transition directly into your sample episodes with a single sentence. And I always like to start this section by emphasizing that, we have so many episode ideas for this show, but we just want to give you a taste. I always like overemphasize, every time that we sit down and we start writing, like we come up with like 6 new episode ideas. Like it just rolls right off of our tongues. But giving that idea of like, there is an entire world to explore here. And there's 2 approaches to sample episodes. The first is rapid fire log lines. Okay. That's basically, hey, here, we have an episode where character A does this, and then character B gets real pissed about it, and that leads to character C having to be the mediator. Boom, boom, boom. And you go through, and you might rifle off anywhere between 6 to 10 of those. It's best served in comedy settings where like you can get the entire episode from the premise. If you're also pitching shorter form, like let's say you're pitching quarter hours, it's probably more useful there. But like, let's say you're telling hour-long serialized dramas, that's probably not the place for rapid fire log lines. But yeah, comedy where you want to get out a lot of the ideas that you have. Like one of the shows that I'm producing right now is like that's the direction that we're going to go with, specifically because we have a ton of really good ideas and all of them are pretty surface level, and we really want to inspire the idea of fun because it's based on old action movies, and so we just want to rapid fire throw out these ideas that in one sentence are going to get the executive laughing and get them excited, and they're going to have so much fun in the room. So that's an example of where a rapid fire log line style is going to really benefit you. The more common approach, and what I usually use, is 2 to 3 sample episodes. My preferred method because, as you guys can probably tell, because I'm doing an hour-long class by myself every week, I like the sound of my own voice, apparently. But specifically, I really enjoy getting to lay out the beats and twists of an entire episode. Like, I like that storytelling aspect. I like being able to use my howevers and my therefores and my, well, everybody thinks it's going this way, but what ends up happening is this, and like really, have that cool twist in there. I feel like that showcases my skill sets the best, but you as the person pitching, you need to figure out what showcases your skill sets the best. It really depends on which style supports your show the very best. And there's 2 main goals to this section. Number 1 is get the executive excited about the possibilities with this series. It's not unlike what we talked about with the pilot, right? We want the executive to go, oh my God, I really want to see that episode. Oh, I want to see how that's going to play out. Oh, I can totally see that. Oh, it's going to be awesome, right? The other main goal is prove that this idea has a lot of meat on the bone, that there are tons of places that you can go, right? Again, we're proving the hypothesis that we said before, right? We're really laying out like, okay, so you know how we said we had a bunch of ideas and that like this is just a garden of overflowing ideas. Here's the garden. Like we weren't BSing you on that, okay? So proving the idea has a lot of meat on the bone. And so when we're thinking about sample episodes, focus on the characters that you just talked through in the character section. Let's spend some time talking about the characters in your sample episodes, all right? So we went through that character section and we highlighted, 4 to 6 main characters. It would be a shame, and I see it happen all the time, where all of a sudden we start bringing up people that we didn't talk about before. Don't start bringing up a bunch of random people or one-off characters that weren't important enough to mention in the previous sections, right? You might really like this idea, but one of the main characters in there is a one-off character that only shows up once a season. It might not be the best sample episode, right? And if a main character doesn't show up in any of your samples, it's a little bit of a red flag. Like, so you spent enough time to devote an entire section of your pitch to this one character, but they're not interesting enough to show up in any of your samples. It feels like what you were pitching for that character doesn't exactly ring true, right? Like we have to put them in a world and you're hesitant as the creator to show them off in any way. Like if you have, and that's a good sign that a main character might not be a main character or might not belong in that big section of characters. If you don't have them in your sample episodes, either find a sample episode where they live or cut them from your character section. And, with certain episodes, you may have a character that like is non-essential, but you need to explain them in that particular episode. So that's understandable. If you bring up a character that isn't mentioned in your characters section, make sure to introduce them with context, the same way that we discussed in the series overview section, right? So let's say you have a character in there that is maybe they're the catalyst for a particular action in there. Maybe they're the inciting incident. Go ahead and give us the context of like, oh, the main character's neighbor had his sprinkler goes off and it ruins our main character's day, and that's really all we ever hear about the neighbor. So just give us the context of it's the neighbor, instead of just saying like their name and then expecting us to know who that is, right? Always when you mention a character for the first time, present them with context. Another thing to remember about characters is your characters should behave in ways that you described in the character section. This is not the place for you to have this character actually gets amnesia in this episode and completely acts differently from their usual personality. That's not the place for this episode. Don't use that as one of your samples. We need to see the characters behaving in the way that you described, right? Again, delivering on the promise of your premise. Delivering also on the promise of your pitch. You told me that this character was a jerk. We need to see them being that specific type of jerk in your sample episodes. Also, if your show wants to tackle current events and hot button issues, there should be at least one sample episode where you do exactly that, right? If one of the like main selling points of your show is like it's of the moment, it's pulled from the zeitgeist, make sure that we see that in your show. That's something that we did with Most Popular Girls. When we pitched the TV version of that, one of the things that we really highlighted was we want this to feel very similarly to South Park, right? Where South Park at its best would talk about like the things that were happening right now. And so we had an episode where we talked about a specific hot button issue that was going to be really controversial, and we showed the nuance and skill that we would address it with. And I literally had an executive tell me yesterday, like, I still think about that episode. I'm like, oh, thanks, man. But if you're going to be that show, show yourself being that show. Also, if you talk about the importance, say, of the family element in your show, there should be one episode that centers around that dynamic. Ultimately, if you, in the beginning of your pitch, you talk about something that you want this show to be, you talk about something that's going to be important on this show, it had better show up in your sample episodes, right? The proof's in the pudding. Show the things that you are talking about. Don't just tell me like, oh yeah, it's going to be super controversial, and then all of the episodes are just like super down the road, boring, middling episodes. Like, be the show that you pitched. Pitch the show that you're going to make and show us the sample episodes that feel and look like the show that you're pitching. And then remember, these episodes should deliver on the promise of the premise in the pilot. They should feel like the show that you've been describing up until this point. And also in your sample episodes, remember to avoid and then storytelling. Just like we talked about earlier, make sure you have howevers, therefores, because ofs. Use those good transitional words. Like, you're going to be telling your stories on a smaller scale than you did with the pilot, but you should be telling them in the same way. You know, if you're going to go in with that 2 to 3 sample episode structure, use the same structure you used on your pilot and shrink it down, right? You know, your pilot, you might have had a paragraph for each act. Your samples, you might have 2 to 3 sentences. So you're basically just taking it, shrinking it down, and you're gonna have 2 or 3 of those, and those are your sample episodes. The other thing that your samples should do is they should showcase different flavors of the show. This is what an ensemble episode looks like. This is what a bottle episode might look like. Oh, in this episode, the conflict springs internally from the relationship between 2 characters. On the other hand, in this episode, the conflict's created by a third-party external force. This is actually something, speaking of Most Popular Girls, that we actually struggled with when we were working on the pitch. Is we had 3 samples that we really liked, and then we looked at it and we realized that all 3 of the episodes followed the exact same structure, and they didn't show any different flavors. We basically took one hot button issue and then built story around it, but none of the stories were coming organically from the relationships between the characters. You know, we got into relationship stuff as a result of that external issue. But we realized that in order to properly pitch the show, we really needed to have stories that came from everywhere, not just from, there's something in the news, there's another thing in the news, oh, a third thing from the news, let's pull all those, boom, we've got our sample episodes. Like, no, like, you want those to be different shades, different flavors. It's a sampler platter, right? So with that in mind, avoid stories that feel too similar to each other. You want that exec walking away going like, oh my God, there are so many different places for this show to go. If we're a restaurant, we want to show a diverse menu with a clear cohesiveness to it. You don't want to be the diner or the Cheesecake Factory that has a 50-page menu that has chow mein and tuna casserole. And you also don't want to be Bubba Gump's, where you're just doing one dish 10 different ways, right? I know that they have like side orders and things at Bubba Gump's, but right, it's fried shrimp, it's boiled shrimp, it's steamed shrimp. Like, we want to have like that perfect balance between those 2 extremes, right? You don't want to be all over the place where you're like, oh my God, this feels like 3 different shows, but you also don't, I realize that I'm doing a spectrum and both of my hands are completely off camera. So you want to have a spectrum. On the one hand, you don't want to go too far to the end where you're pitching 3 different shows, and you also don't want a situation. Now I'm so freaking self-conscious about the location of my hands now. But you don't want you don't want a show where it's just like the same episode repeated in 13 different ways. That's no fun either. So find that balance. The other thing that I want you to do is find the fun connective tissue wherever possible. See how you can tie episodes together. Like, we really want our show to feel like it's one thing. It's a connected whole. I'll give you an example. It's a little bit off color, so fair warning. When we were pitching Shark Tour, we had one episode that ended with Shark, who, if you remember, he's the jerk of the show. And so he finishes the episode calling the whole town assholes and wieners. And the next episode is focused on the main character's sex life. So that was an easy transition for my writers to go, speaking of assholes and wieners, that takes us to Shark in the Streets. And I forget what the name of the episode was, but like little transitional statements like that are free laughs in the pitch room. And that is gold. Like, anytime that you can get a free laugh, a free aha moment, those moments, like, take them wherever you can. They are so valuable in a pitch. And a great way to do that is through connective tissue. So get creative and tie your stuff together as much as possible. Also, a very specific note about sample episodes: do not hold rigidly to the idea that your season is going to be a particular number of episodes. You don't get to decide that. Your network does. The executive listening to that statement will always 100% dismiss it. I can't tell you the number of times that I've been in a pitch meeting and a creator will tell me like, okay, so we have so the first season is going to be 8 episodes, and episode 1 is going to be this, and episode 2 is going to be this, episode 3 is going to be this, episode 4 is going to be this, and on through all 8 episodes. And I go, okay, but what if I only give you enough money to make 6 episodes? Or what if I want 13 episodes? You're just going to be like, nah. Like what, what if I tell you like I need 13 episodes for my slate? So if you're not going to give me 13 episodes, we don't have a deal. Or are you really going to say, nah, I know you're offering me the money for 13 episodes, but I only want to do 4, right? Like the only people that get to dictate episode orders are like the top level auteurs, you as the person pitching, you don't get to say, this is how long the season's going to be. And you shouldn't pitch that way. You shouldn't pitch your samples as, I have a finite story. It's going to be this long. It's going to be structured exactly this way. Because the other thing that tells an executive is you might be kind of a pain in the ass in the development process. You might not be ready to collaborate, and you might not understand how development works. Like there are plenty of bad executives, but I would argue that there are probably even more good executives who really know what they're doing when it comes to notes and how to develop a show and how to take it from a pitch to an actual series on TV. And if you're putting forward in the pitch room the idea that you're not easy to collaborate with, that's just one more reason why I'm not going to buy your show. So all that to say, don't hold rigidly to the idea that your season is going to be a particular number of episodes. Another little thing, it's okay to be a little bit technical about things like format. You can explain. So this is an example of what an episode looks like outside of an office or outside of the office. Like if the main show's in an office, this is what an episode looks like outside the office. This is what an episode looks like that focuses really heavily on the dynamic between the two main characters. It's okay to tell us the different flavors that you're serving us. You're like a chef on Top Chef presenting and saying like, today I made for you a grilled pork with a roasted spinach. So, you're just laying it out and explaining it for us, and like sometimes that's going to help your cause. So don't worry about like, oh no, I don't want to get too technical. It's going to be too boring. Just get through it. Visual aids. Let's hit again on visual aids. For your sample episodes, you should have a new slide for each episode. Along with the episode title, you might use a screen grab, a main character, something that IDs the episode. If you're doing big sample episodes, you can also use the beat by beat images that we use in the pilot. Like if there's a bunch of little like twists and turns in your story, use that beat by beat example. The really bad example that I used of the woman who hires somebody to climb a mountain for her. The real reason why we use visual aids, especially at this point, is it creates movement. We've talked in the past about how the visual aids, how they can really give a shorthand, help us remember the names of characters. At this point, the other thing that they do is they create movement, because at this point in our pitch, we're starting to come up to the end, and everyone knows that. Once you're hitting sample episodes, like we've been sitting here for about 15 minutes, we know that we're starting to wrap things up. And that means that people are starting to get restless. And the novelty of a new slide helps mitigate that restlessness. As somebody who has severe ADHD, who is never not restless, I can tell you how true this is. If you're coming in, you're pitching me something, and you've got new slides coming in on your sample episodes, that's keeping my attention a lot better than if you didn't. The new slide helps constantly refocus the attention back on you and what you're saying. I also want to show just a couple of examples of that. I know we're running a little bit tight on time here, but let's take a look. These are a few examples from a couple of different shows that I did. The first one is from Shark Tour. So the name of the episode was Natural Election. The other thing that I like to do on these are just presented as screen grabs, but I like to use Keynote Animations. Same thing with PowerPoint or Google Slides, but I'll have like, the characters will slide up, the title will slide down on them. Just creates a little bit more of something interesting to look at. So, we just had the episode title and a little visual of, hey, here's what happens in the episode. Let me go ahead and screen over to the next one. This one was called Old Shark, Look at Your Life. And in this one, the son on the show took a bunch of steroids playing baseball. So there's that. And then this was the sex episode that we were talking about, a lark in the streets and a shark in the sheets, right? It's something visually interesting to look at. This one might get a little bit of a laugh, same as the last one. All of those free laughs in the room are gold. Here's an example for most popular girls. Sample episode was called The New Britney, where, we see this character in the background. Is that the new Britney that we're talking about? It wasn't. It was just a random screen grab from the show. But all that you need is that little hint, that visual to make it look like this could be pulled from that exact episode. Another really interesting idea that we did on one of my shows, I had a show called Space World that was a comedy set in space with Tommy Wiseau from The Room. And so the whole idea was they traveled all through the galaxy. And so each episode was named after a different planet in the solar system that they visited. So there was a planet called the Blob. There's a little region over here. And so that was the name of the episode. So when we were talking about the Blob episode, here's the visual aid that we utilized. The name of this planet was Mortunis. So this was a whole different area. So we talked about the episode, had this really pretty visual. The visuals on this show, it was another animated show, so they were really good. So we wanted to take advantage of that. And then we laid out in big letters, Mortunis. And then there was an episode that took place on the Great Trash Pile. So all of those elements allowed us to really just dig in and explain the episode and keep your attention. And we're throwing all these different visuals at you so that you're constantly refocusing. And that's the big thing that those visual aids do. I see we have a couple of questions coming back now. Looks like somebody got frozen. Okay, looks like we're still good. And then the last thing we want to talk about really quickly here is season arcs. And I saved season arcs for let's get rid of the Great Trash Pile. We don't need you anymore. So we saved season arcs here for the last. They're going to be pretty much, they're going to feel like this. They're going to feel a little bit just like you're going to pop through them really quickly at the end of your pitch. When you're talking about season one, you want to focus on season one first, obviously, and walk us through the big arc of the season. This goes for whether your show is serialized or it's episodic. Some of the questions that we want to ask and have answered: how will the characters change over the course of the season? Is there a goal that they're trying to achieve, and do they achieve it? Where will we find ourselves at the end of this season? Where does it set up for season two? Or, quite possibly, is your show a limited series? Mention that in there. And this is like I said, this is necessary even if your show isn't serialized. It's going to be a little bit harder, right? But you want to have some type of arc where the characters are going, some type of character development, something happening in the world over the course of that season. The phrase that I always like to use if I'm pitching episodic is, you can drop in at any point, but our most dedicated viewers are going to get rewarded. We're going to make sure that there's enough of a season arc that if you're watching this thing all the way through and you're really invested, that you'll be rewarded storytelling wise. That's kind of how I like to view episodic storytelling. With serialized, you're going to walk through the plot of your first season and talk about what's going to happen. But really focus, stay focused on characters and relationships as you're talking about that thing. We don't need as much, and then, focus on those big storytelling aspects. And then when you dig into your future seasons, this is going to be dependent on the type of show that you have. You might just want to hit a general, hey, here's where we want to go for future seasons. Or you may want to go, season 2, this is going to happen. Season 3, this is going to happen. Season 4 is, and maybe there's a big grouping of future seasons after that. But depending on the nature of the show, you may want to build a long roadmap or just give us a more general vision for where you can see things going. Ultimately, what you're trying to convey to the buyers is that what you're doing, that you have a vision for this show, and that it's something that you believe in, that you can see the future of this show. You don't have to be tied to it. We as executives know, this isn't written in stone at all. Again, stay away from rigid statements like, I planned out every episode of the entire 6-season series, along with the follow-up film and the accompanying app, because that tells me as an executive, you're going to be a pain in the ass to work with and that you're not prepared to collaborate. Ultimately, though, show that you have a vision for the future of the series, but that you also understand the nature of the creative process. And last thing with future seasons, if you got a big twist somewhere in there that turns the series on its head, share it. Like with The Good Place, By the way, I'm going to spoil The Good Place right now. But you better believe that they mentioned in their future season arc the big twist that they were actually in hell and what would need to happen after the first season. Especially if you have something like kind of cataclysmic happen at the end of that first season, let us know that there's still a show there and what it's going to look like. So, all that being said, that is it for episodes and future seasons. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Whether you're watching this live or on delay, you can leave comments if you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube. I go through past episodes to make sure if there's comments that are left over that we address them at the top of the show. Also, as a reminder, I do this for a living. So I have pitch coaching and I produce pitch decks. If you have interest in any of those services, MARANTY.com, promo code Catalyst. Folks, we are weeks away from the festival. I am so excited to see you all in person. I know that we're all going to be fully vaccinated, so that's awesome. I'm loving this experience. Thank you so much for making this possible, for joining me. And let's go pitch some shows and sell them and make a bunch of money and put good art out into the world. Thank you all so much. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Bye.